The Way We Met is the 25th and final episode of the first season of The Golden Girls, and this does something incredible because I usually hate flashback episodes of any TV show, any sitcom. I usually cannot stand them. There are, of course, a few exceptions, and The Way We Met is definitely one of those exceptions. This is fantastic, and actually, when I realised what this was about, I was really looking forward to this because it details how Blanche, Rose and Dorothy actually came to live together, and this is always something that I was really keen to find out more about. So the fact that they've dedicated the final episode of the first season to this, I think is really brilliant. As I said, there will be spoilers from now as I talk about the episode. And it starts off in the kitchen in present day. All of the present day scenes are in the kitchen. And initially Rose went into the kitchen, and then Dorothy went in, and then Blanche did, because they all heard a noise, a different kind of noise. And the reason they're all kind of scared at the moment is because they'd actually watched Psycho, which I can completely understand as a huge horror fan. I love watching horror, but there are times when, even though I absolutely love it, it does make me quite scared. So completely relate to how they're feeling, and they decide to have some cheesecake around the table, and they start to reminisce about how they came to live together. And here we have the flashbacks. And I didn't time it, but I feel like it's probably 50% set in the flashback and 50% in present day. I could be wrong ever so slightly, but in general, it feels like it has a pretty even split. And we see Rose by the neighbourhood notices board carrying a cat. We learn that this cat is called Mr. Peepers, and Rose is no longer able to live in her apartment, and she meets Blanche. And initially Blanche says, maybe we could live together. And then Rose opens her mouth and Blanche decides they're not the same kind of people. But then we have the most beautiful, beautiful moment where this little boy sees Rose carrying this cat, Mr. Peepers, and he approaches her and very politely asks if he can stroke the cat. And Rose bends down and says yes, and he's stroking the cat and telling the story about how his cat has recently died, and it's heartbreaking. And Rose asks the little boy if his mother would let him have another cat, which I feel was a really sensible thing to do, to actually ask about that first. And when he said yes, his mother's going to get him a cat, I think he said next week, Rose suggested that he takes this cat, because Rose actually only found the cat recently, and Rose didn't want to live anywhere without the cat because, as she said, it wouldn't be fair for her to have a home if the cat didn't. And the fact that she gave this cat to the little boy is just, it's so beautiful. And Blanche saw this, realised Rose was actually a really good person, and decided that she could have a look at one of the rooms. And we then cut to a scene a little while later, and Blanche is actually showing the other room to Madame Zelda, a woman called Madame Zelda, who is pretty fantastic, I have to say. Really brilliant character. Really enjoyed what she brought into this very briefly. And then there's a knock at the door. It's Dorothy with her mother, and Dorothy had previously spoken on the phone to Blanche. She came to look at the room, and she brought Sophia along, I guess because she was just spending time with her, and that was a nice way to bring Sophia into the episode a little bit more. And obviously Rose and Dorothy both move in, but it's not a great start. Dorothy seems quite abrasive. She's not really used to Rose's ways, and obviously it takes her a little while to get used to that. And we then cut back to the present day, and I really like the rate at which we went back and forth. I feel like each moment in the flashback had enough time to play out, but without us feeling like we could forget what was happening in the present. Because there are some shows where they'll have a flashback and they'll so seldomly cut back to the present day that it's almost like we can forget there's a present day aspect. And I think they managed to get the balance here spot on. And Rose says they always had a great time together, and then they started to talk about the first time they went shopping, which, if I remember, was the previous day, and we see them on this shopping trip, and it's really well done, really great space, and they are very different people. And Dorothy has this giant stick of meat, and Rose is being a good Samaritan and telling the cashier she's doing everything wrong and putting things through too cheaply, and they're all very, very different people. and it's actually a delight to watch, and I really thoroughly enjoyed it. And it's fair to say, based purely on that initial interaction, how could they go on to being such good friends and living together so well? And I think that's kind of the whole point, that initially they didn't necessarily get off to the strongest of starts, but obviously they gave the friendship time, the relationship in living together, they gave it time, and it was so worth it, of course. When they're back in the kitchen in the flashback, Rose is telling a story about a herring and this herring circus. And because Dorothy and Blanche aren't really used to Rose's ways yet, they find this hysterical. I feel like if Rose was telling this story now, in the present day, they would just kind of give her a look and basically ignore what she was saying. But because this quirky personality and her quirky stories were so fresh, they basically dissolved into uncontrollable laughter. And I did worry for a second that Rose was going to take this offensively and she was going to be really hurt by it, but actually she started to laugh as well and kind of poke fun at the situation, and it was really, really lovely to see. And they do ultimately end up bonding over cheesecake, which is really sweet. And then back in the present day, we see them still bonding over cheesecake in the middle of the night. They're about to, they're about to go to it's funny, I promise. They're about to go to bed and the kitchen door bursts open and there's Sophia with a knife in her hand, and I've never seen anybody put so much effort into wielding a knife before. It's absolutely incredible. Obviously she did this to scare them because they just watched Psycho, and she clearly had a lot of fun with it, and I thought that was a really nice way again to include Sophia in the story, since it wasn't really about Sophia, it was about Blanche, Dorothy and Rose, and it was an absolute delight and a really nice way to end things. Really fun episode in a lot of ways, but really moving as well, with some great messages about how differences can actually work well. So if you are in a situation where you're living with somebody for the first time and you don't think you're going to get along, there's probably going to be common ground, even if that common ground is cheesecake. I thought it was an absolute joy. As I said, when I realised what it was about, I was really, really looking forward to it, as I was really desperate to find out how they came to live together and to kind of know the nitty-gritty specific details behind that. And I just found that the way we met was an absolute joy, and definitely a really strong way to end a really wonderful first season of The Golden Girls.